Hey guys, it's Mitch. How's it going? I'm going to be stepping out of my comfort zone a little bit today on this one. This is going to be a pointedly optimistic book with minimal rendering and shadow. That's done in a cartoony kind of manga-influenced sort of style. So yeah, nothing really like the usual stuff that gets featured on the channel. We're looking at ZOT #1 by Scott McCloud. And if you're watching this channel, you probably know that name. Scott McCloud is the author of Understanding Comics, which I would say is probably the definitive book on comics theory, which is a thing. First printed in 1993, it goes through the history of comics, as well as the nuts and bolts of how comics works, like sequential art. And by nuts and bolts, I don't mean things like, pen nibs and brushes and ink, although there's obviously mention of that in there. I'm talking about like how panel-to-panel transitions work, the role of symbolism in comics. I think it's fair to say that very few people have thought about the underlying elements of comics as much as Scott McCloud has. So just to finish that part up, if you haven't read Understanding Comics, I wholeheartally recommend it. I also recommend Making Comics, which is his much more recent book. This one was published in 2005, and, the title says it all. It's everything involved with how to effectively make comic books. And they're knowledgeable to the point where I know there are comics-based university or college courses at somewhere, nowhere where I went, but, somewhere. And Understanding Comics is required reading for those courses. So from the perspective of a guy who thinks about how comics work way more than, most people, I thought it would be interesting to check out his most famous comic. ZOT was produced in 1984 under Eclipse Comics, and it was very much a reaction to the current climate, the then current climate in comics at the time, which is that they were getting more gritty and nihilistic and grim, which is interesting because we were still a couple of years off from the definitive grim, pessimistic comic works in Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. But Scott McCloud's a guy who likes his upbeat comics. He was very heavily influenced by manga when he was a kid. He specifically references Astro Boy as being a primary influence on this particular book. And that influence is pretty obvious, even to a guy who didn't read Astro Boy. You can very much see that, 70s manga influence in this. So why don't we get right into this? We can start with the cover. In terms of the construction, it's a very good cover. I think there may be a few people who watch this channel who might get turned off by this kind of cover because, it's very bright and there's minimal clean line work. That's very much Scott McCloud's style, where it's almost animation-based. We've got our lead character here, ZOT, coming towards us, some forced perspective going on, as well as some speed lines. We've got our camera tilt. We've also got some pretty, well-established backgrounds in the back here, at least in terms of perspective, which is going to be a recurring thing in this comic. So yeah, in terms of construction elements, there's already a whole bunch of stuff on here that Scott McCloud would go over later in his Understanding Comics book. But you get the feeling that most of the stuff that's in that book, he's already been thinking about at this point. So as I said, this was published by Eclipse Comics, which were a pretty small publisher in the 80s and 90s. Although they do have a few titles in their lineup that I do recognize, such as Dave Stevens' Rocketeer and Tim Truman's Scout, and a couple more that'll pop up in the back matter in this issue. So they had some quality creators in their stable anyway. It seems like they didn't always remember to pay those creators, but, probably the big ones they did. So anyway, we're going to start things off with a missive from Scott McCloud himself in the front cover here, where he basically gives you a breakdown on what ZOT is about. And he starts off telling you basically the mission statement, which is, welcome to ZOT #1, home of one of the most incorrigibly happy heroes you'll ever meet. And the place that ZOT is from is a pretty esoteric concept from what I can see here. So here you'll explore an Earth of futures, not of the future, mind you. We'll get plenty of that when it happens, but of all the futures we've been dreaming up for years. These are the bright and sunny tomorrows that didn't quite pan out in the long run, worlds foretold in books and dramatic works of years gone by, that seems so far-fetched and innocent next to what we actually got. So you'd be thinking of futurism from the 50s or the 30s, where we're all supposed to be living in glass colonies on the moon. And you take a rocket ship to work, And it's not just a specific futuristic ideal. By the sound of it, it sounds like it encompasses several futuristic prognostications. Again, I'm not sure exactly how it works. I've only read the one comic, so, I might be interpreting that wrong. But he says here that the point of ZOT is that it embodies that recklessly hopeful spirit that creates these futures and gives the present some direction and meaning. Again, we're getting kind of philosophical here, right off the bat. And it's interesting reading this, having read understanding comics and making comics. And it's just kind of a familiar voice where, you get the idea that Scott McCloud gets very excited when talking about comics. So we might as well start here on page 1. ZOT by Scott McCloud. He does the pencils and the inks. And an interesting supporting cast on this one. Letters by Todd Klein in 1984. Colors by Tom Zuko. I don't know who that is, but I mean, you can see what they're doing with the colors here. It's very animation cell kind of looking. Script consultant, Kurt Busiek, because apparently Kurt Busiek and Scott McCloud were high school buddies. And Dean Mullaney and Kat Ironwood as editors. So, there's a few names you'd recognize there. So, yeah, our opening splash. He's fought on a dozen worlds, rushed headlong into 100 deadly battles, and saved the lives of thousands. His fame has spread like wildfire throughout the massive galaxy he calls home. Now another world will know his name. Now ZOT comes to Earth. So, yeah, ZOT is a super famous, happy adventurer, ultra-dimensional kid hero. And we're going to start with a technique that actually kind of reminds me of Ghost Rider #1, which we saw just recently. Which is you have your big kind of opening shot of your guy, and then what feels like a pan down into a much more regular situation, which in this case is a young girl who's just moved to LA, and she's wandering around her new neighborhood. And she's just kind of complaining to herself that she doesn't know anybody here, and she has nothing to do. She's 13, and this is the kind of thing that 13-year-olds worry about. On her travels through her neighborhood, she spots a frog, and she starts chatting with the frog, and because, she doesn't have anybody to talk to. Why not? And then her brother comes up behind her, and her brother's, he's not exactly a bully, but he definitely pushes the envelope on how older siblings treat younger siblings. So, for instance, he's got to grab that frog, which she says, no way, not after what you did to the last one. And, I mean, it looks like he kind of squishes it here, and then she runs after him, yelling, "Murderer, come back here." But, she trips, older brother gets away, and she's kind of stuck feeling sorry for herself. And then this dimensional rift opens up in front of her. So at least we don't have to wait too long to get into the action on this. Very different kind of start on this to what we're used to, at least on this channel. It does feel very manga influenced, and, the slow kind of just everyday world that we're presenting first, and then we have to intrude on that world. I'm not a big fan of how Scott McCloud draws faces, the finish on there, but then again, I'm not a fan of those kind of manga either, that have kind of similar features on their characters. In terms of his backgrounds, they're all very good. There's a lot of attention paid to perspective, and he makes sure that he's giving enough detail that nothing feels like it's being skimped over. His figure work, I'd say, is also very good. If, it is kind of cartoony, but, there's no stiffness to it, which is important. So, all right. The dimensional rift, if you forgot. ZOT comes screaming through it, yelling "Yeehaw!" And our lead here, who hasn't been named just yet, is kind of frozen in shock because, you would be. And he lands on the roof, yells down at her, "Hey, get out of the way." And she looks back at the portal to see what he's pointing at, and all of these killer robots come running through the portal. ZOT yells, "Hold on, I'll save you," and flies down, scoops her up, and gets her out of the way. And again, I'm not a big fan of the finish on this, although, for younger kids, this is totally appropriate. I don't think you have any kind of problem with this if you're 11, 12, 13 in 1984. And we can see him using the kind of elements that he would talk about in understanding comics to emphasize things. So, for instance, going outside of panel borders, going gigantic image here, because, we've been pretty strict about panel borders up until now. And then all of a sudden, there's no panel border here. It feels like the moment has expanded beyond the constraints of normal space and time. We get the photocopied image here. Is it photocopied or lightboxed? I think it's actually lightboxed. Just showing no real change between the two panels to show that the main character has been frozen in place. We get another irregularly shaped panel showing the robots coming through. When ZOT flies down, he's busting outside of the panel border. And we're getting some of those manga-influenced speed lines all over the place here. Interestingly, it doesn't look like he's using rulers on them either. This looks like it's all hand done. So, ZOT takes a zap gun and blows all the robots to pieces. And he's just kind of shaking this off as business as usual. And, sorry if you got your feathers ruffled there, but kind of had to shove you out of the way for a second. And our main character here is still stunned and confused. So she needs some explanations. He says his name is Zachary T. Paleozocht, and very clearly he's from another world. She's still confused, so, he thinks about it for a second and goes, Okay, you know what? I can tell you an origin story because we're at that part of the comic. Again, there's some nice techniques going on in here, such as the time-lapse effect here, when ZOT is like super speed shooting down all the robots. We're using some very small vertical panels here to show that, you know, all of these shots are hitting home in very quick succession. And of course, doing a very good job to differ the angle from panel to panel so that nothing ever feels like we're sitting in a two-shot or something like that. So we're going to get our background now in a big double-page spread. So we start out with ZOT's world here, which is super happy and optimistic, but they've got a closest neighbor world, which is very serious, and they've got all these rules and regulations. And the big deal to this world is this key here, which opens up a doorway at the edge of the universe. So it's just this regular-ass door hanging in the middle of space that apparently only this key opens, and it's, you know, very important to them. This is kind of the foundation of their spirituality, as far as I can tell. And one day, somebody stole the key out from under that world's nose. You get the feeling this might have been ZOT, actually, by the way that Scott McCloud kind of keeps him in shadow constantly. I could be wrong on that, but, you know, who knows. So they finally bring him back. He doesn't have the key anymore. And then they're the ones who send out the killer robots to go and find the key. And this causes widespread destruction and panic, so ZOT has to go from world to world and try to minimize the damage. And, you know, the first jump through the dimensional portal led him here. So she's kind of up to date now. We finally get her name, which is Jenny Weaver. Very kind of girl next door name. And this is, I mean, kind of exactly what she's been hoping for. You know, she was complaining earlier that she didn't know anybody and she didn't have anything to do. And it's like, well, here you go. Here's an interdimensional mystery for you to unravel, an adventure. And she asks ZOT if she can go back with him. And after a little bit of thinking about it, he goes, yeah, okay, we could do that, I suppose. And that's when one more of the killer robots pops up behind them and smacks ZOT out of the way. His ray gun goes flying. Jenny has to pick it up. And ZOT had said earlier that there was only one charge left in it. So she only gets one shot to take him out. Again, the storytelling in this is really good. You know, like we actually get a bit of a surprise here going from panel to panel. And I like this shot quite a bit of ZOT getting knocked on the jaw. Get the lettering sneaking out of the panel border here. That's great stuff. We lose the panel border in this case when the ray gun goes flying because it's kind of a timeless moment. And then we're going to go with short panel, moment-to-moment transitions to show that this is all happening in slow motion for Jenny Weaver. And naturally, she makes the shot. We get a big, irregularly shaped panel to emphasize it, and then we get a cool-down panel here once the moment has passed us by. And she kind of drops the ray gun here, goes to pick it up right when ZOT does, and, you know, their fingers touch, and then they get all blushy and shit. It's like, oh, it's that. Okay. And then ZOT immediately takes off for the portal here. I guess he got a little embarrassed. And police sirens are starting to show up, and the neighbors are all yelling about the noise. We get the panel tilt to show that this is kind of affecting Jenny. And it turns out her brother somehow found the key that everybody's looking for. This part, I don't know. I mean, it's, you know, it's about as Deus Ex Machina as you can get. I guess that's kind of the point. And it's not going to be like, you know, we've solved the problem, now we have to find new problems. Because, you know, this is going to carry over. But still, it's like, really? You found it? Okay, good for you. Jenny snatches the key from her brother and takes off for the portal. Her brother takes off after her, and he's the one who trips this time, knocking them both in. And the portal closes up right behind them, right when one of the neighbors is trying to stop them here, and they kind of point out of existence. And again, when the brother trips, we get the panels tumbling around here. It's interesting to see this kind of book created by somebody who's such a student of the medium, knowing that he's actively, you know, trying to use all of these techniques. So this is where Jenny and her brother, I don't know if the brother got named actually. I don't know. He'll come up at some point. It's probably Max. Oh, it's Butch. I was close. So they teleport in right at the top of this gigantic friggin' building. And this is, again, that manga influence with, you get the cartoony characters, and the point of the cartoony characters is to help with identification, because Scott McCloud explains in Understanding Comics, basically the more you simplify something like a face, the more relatable it becomes. Because, I mean, like you look at like a smiley face, that could be anybody. Once you start defining characteristics, you go, okay, well, it's definitely not this guy, it's not this guy, it's not this guy, until you get to the point of photorealism where it's like, oh, it's that guy. So the cartoony figures and faces are purposeful, but at the same time, Scott McCloud's going to employ a technique that was very heavily used in manga, which is to have the cartoony protagonists, but also have very highly detailed backgrounds and objects. Because we don't need to relate to those elements. We need to basically understand the details of them so that the characters we do relate to, we can understand the situation they're in more fully. You know what? I haven't even read the Understanding comics recently. It's nice to know that those lessons are sticking. So anyway, yeah, Jenny is dangling from the precipice here. This panel is impressive. It's 3-point perspective, which is not some kind of crazy technique or anything. If you've been working in comics or you've been trained to work in comics, you should know how to implement 1 and 2 and 3-point perspective. I've never used 3-point myself, but I rarely use 1-point perspective, so that's maybe not the biggest qualifier there. I don't know, just seeing somebody implement it so effectively and maybe even diligently is the right word. Is, like I say, impressive. And again, to use it to such intent. And we get our no top and bottom borders to just, again, give it kind of an endless moment feel. And you get that vertical panel to show the height that Jenny is dangling from. Butch goes to try and save her, grab her hand, but he's a little bit too late, and she falls. Get all the background zooming past her here. She kind of falls unconscious, which, understandable, I think. And then wakes up a little while later, and for some reason, she's in ZOT's home, so I guess she must have been saved. Butch is also there with ZOT and the robot butler. So this is Peabody, which, again, feels like a very manga kind of name. So it turns out that ZOT ordered Peabody to kind of patrol around the bottom of the building in case something like this happened, and he was able to catch Jenny before she hit the ground. And right around here is where Jenny's starting to realize that, wait a minute, we're on another world. And ZOT says, yep, welcome one and all to the far-flung future of 1965. So again, kind of the futurism of the 30s, 40s, 50s. So now that we've established, our new setting, we have to refocus back to our objective. Peabody reminds ZOT, maybe we should be looking for this key thing again. And Jenny just says, oh, right, the key. I have that. And he's like, no way. Man, that was easy. You just saved everybody a whole lot of trouble. And Peabody's kind of a stick in the mud. He goes, okay, you should take that immediately back to the Sirius Church. And ZOT, who's all happy-go-lucky, is like, well, we can take it back after we do some sightseeing, right? And Peabody's like, or you could do some sightseeing after you take it back. And they decide to compromise. Okay, we'll sightsee on the way. So they're going to take off in their little space rocket here. Get a nice vertical panel showing the ascent here. And we get told what the deal is with Peabody, which is that he was programmed to be kind of a stand-in parent, but ZOT and a friend of his reprogrammed him a little bit. So he's not quite as stern as a parent should be. Like, they were able to push his parameters a little bit, but he's still pretty stern. So, for instance, he won't let ZOT drive the rocket car in this case because ZOT doesn't have a license. He's too young. In addition, ZOT is allowed to go out on adventures, but he does need to be chaperoned. All right, so we're heading into the city here where they're going to meet with the different leaders that would be involved in this sort of political matter. So zooming through the city, we get a nice kind of panoramic view of it here. Again, I guess they're not overly detailed buildings, but the attention to the perspective is maybe the most important thing here. And as they're zooming through, all the people are like, hey, look, it's ZOT. And they all start cheering and everything because he's a local kid hero, And yeah, Peabody's zooming along because they don't have time for this kind of thing. ZOT says you're going too fast. And then we get the cops catching up to them here. And it's like, oh man, they're going to get in trouble. And then the cops are just like, hey, you're ZOT. Can I get an autograph for my daughter? So that's the only reason they pulled up. And ZOT's like, sure, I'll give you one too. So incorrigibly happy is, that's a pretty good description of the character. So once he gives out the autographs, then they're free to go on their way. And there's a little thing here that I actually missed on the first read through. This little droid thing that notices them when they start flying through and kind of tags along, is able to keep up with the car. And Scott McCloud makes a point of highlighting the fact that it's keeping up with them. All right, so now we're going to CPZP, which is the colonized planets of Zone P. So sort of a central building where all of the world or planet leaders can convene. We've got the representative for the Sirius government, so those are the guys who initially had the key. And like I said, the key is part of their religion, and they're very much about rules, regulations, keeping everything very strict. Everybody else around here, they're a bit more loosey-goosey. And obviously the people from Sirius, and I just realized what I was saying out loud, because it's spelled, Sirius as in the dog star, but yeah, no, Sirius as opposed to unserious, sure. But the key is the most important thing to their society, and, obviously they're going to try and get it back at any means necessary. And the rest of the planets are, dude, you got to chill out a little bit with the killer robots. It's not a good look. And that's when ZOT and his friends come into the proceedings. First, he addresses the Sirius representative and tells him, I had to curtail a killer robot incursion on another planet that doesn't have anything to do with you. And he suggests that further actions of this kind should be halted, and that the Sirius leadership should be held responsible for the actions of the church officials, and all repairs and payments be referred to those agencies exclusively. So holding them accountable and kind of holding them over a barrel, because he announces at that point that they've got the key. And of course, right when he's announcing that little droid that followed them along kind of snitches the key off of Jenny here and takes off. Yeah, asks Jenny if she can maybe hand over the key now, and Jenny's about to reply that she doesn't have it when they get attacked by a de-evolutionist who also wants the key. And he starts shooting everybody with de-evolving rays, which is going to revert all the people in here to monkeys. So ZOT has to spring into action once again, jumping out of the panel border here, because, we got to emphasize that this is all fast-paced action stuff now. As he zips all across the room, we get him zooming through here. All the background is just reduced to speed lines. The Sirius priest tries to sneak up on the attacker. He turns around quickly and, again, turns him into a monkey. Jen is hiding behind Peabody and asks why ZOT doesn't use his ray gun. And Peabody explains that the gun only has one setting, which is destroy, and ZOT will never use it against fellow humans. So even though the attacker is definitely rude, he doesn't deserve that kind of punishment. And the action stuff here is pretty fun. We're getting a lot of, kind of that time-lapse effect while ZOT is zooming around the room. A lot of speed lines as he's just zipping everywhere. So Peabody's in communication with ZOT, tells him to fly closer and look at the floor beneath the attacker's feet. So ZOT does that and notices the emergency sub-zero extinguisher unit. So that he's able to shoot, and he hits that, and this big wave of, I guess, cold just engulfs the attacker. These sound effects are absolutely great, by the way. I know I haven't really said much throughout this, but this is just kind of quintessential comics lettering. I'm sure that's what Todd Klein's going for. Kind of like a timeless comics feel. And if anybody can pull it off, it's going to be him. So, with the attacker out of commission, ZOT's able to pick up his de-evolving gun, which he quickly changes the settings on to turn it into a re-evolving gun, and then goes about changing all the people who are hit by the rays back into their human forms. So that angers the attacker, and he pulls out like a regular old grenade, which ZOT snatches from him, and then takes off and flies over the city, throws it far so that the explosion won't injure anybody, and it goes off, so he got rid of it just in time. So then he flies back, takes the de-evolving gun back, and destroys it in front of the attacker. And that's when Jenny has to pull up aside and say, sorry, but I lost the key. And ZOT has to turn to the congregation here and go, sorry about that, guys. I guess I don't have the key after all. So the council decides that in lieu of today's events, with multiple people after this key and it just causing all sorts of chaos, that they have to prioritize finding it. And the Sirius official here is not happy that ZOT seems to be taking the lead on this, but hey, ZOT's happy to be of service, and the council guy says, whatever. All those in favor? Everybody gives an aye, except for Butch, who has not been re-evolved. And he says ook, because he's still in monkey form. And ZOT realizes that he destroyed the de-evolutionary gun, so he can't change him back. And that's kind of where the story's going to end, at least for this issue. We got our preview page here for next issue, where ZOT goes into the grid to catch a thief. Take the word for it. And some ads for, some books I don't really know. Adventures to California, don't know you. Destroyer Duck, I've heard of that at least. And a letters page in the making. As well as Mystery, I've also heard of that. Aztec Ace, not very familiar. All right, so that's ZOT number 1. So it is a lot of fun. It's maybe too lighthearted for some people. You got to be in kind of a particular mindset for it, where, that kind of lightheartedness is okay. It's not really something that most people would be used to anymore, I suppose, after reading like 40 years worth of grim and gritty comics. But it's very interesting to look at with the knowledge of what Scott McCloud would do after this and seeing him just putting all these techniques into use. And the ZOT comic itself would go for a little while. It was about 35 issues. But this particular format actually didn't last that long. It only lasted until issue 10. And then Scott McCloud kind of went into negotiation with Eclipse, and they decided to try again with issue 11, only without any interior color. And that stuck, which is interesting. And I wondered if, like, maybe they dropped the cover price or something, and they didn't. They raised it, if anything. But yeah, it seems like there was much more appetite for this as a black and white book than as a color book, which is, again, interesting. Like, I think all the flat color does kind of work in this case. It does look very animation looking. But I also wouldn't mind checking out what it looks like in the black and white form. I know going forward from here, Scott McCloud would keep trying to implement new techniques. And I think he kind of focuses quite a bit on backgrounds in the black and white version of this story, where he's trying to kind of incorporate elements from like Otomo's Akira. With the level of detail, you know, he's not going to get all the way there, but he gets kind of close. And just that scope, like that epic scope that Akira always seems to have. So yeah, it'd be interesting to check out those later issues. You know, we probably won't hit any on this channel, but as, you know, like a one-off, I was definitely interested in checking out this particular one. So anyway, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks very much for watching. If you like this video, please hit the like button. Helps out with the algorithm stuff. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. And if you really want to help out, in the description, there's a link to my Patreon. And if you subscribe there, that gives you access to everything I do. So whole bunch of videos, whole bunch of comic book art. Also in the description, there's a link to the merch store. That's where you can get all the Blood Force merch. So, you know, the Blood Force hats, the Blood Force t-shirt, the Hawkstab mug, or the Popo fanny pack. These are all available for sale, because why the hell not? You can also follow me on Instagram and DM me there for commissions. Commissions are open. So yeah, that's going to do it. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.